It began with a slow erosion, like water wearing down a stone. From the outside, I'm sure we looked like any other family: 2 kids, a nice house, weekend outings, and shared laughter over dinner. We built a good life. My wife and I, or at least that's how it had felt for years. But lately, there had been a strain, a fracture beneath the surface that I couldn't quite name. My wife, Jenna, was a woman I'd always admired, fiercely protective and quick to nurture. She poured so much love and energy into our daughter, Lily, that it sometimes felt like the sun rose and set on that little girl. I never thought much of it at first. Perhaps I even adored Jenna more for the bond she shared with Lily. But it was becoming impossible to ignore that our son, Sam, often stood on the sidelines, receiving a sliver of what seemed to flow so easily toward Lily. It hadn't always been this way, I reminded myself. There were once times when Jenna would cradle Sam with that same tenderness, laughing at his small jokes, cheering him on at his soccer games. But somewhere along the way, a shift had occurred, so subtle and gradual that I could hardly remember when I'd first noticed it. Now, I saw my son's hesitant glances, his shrinking posture, and the way he waited for his mother's words that rarely came. Jenna wasn't overtly harsh, not in a way that would stand out to someone else, but she was different with him, quieter, colder. There was a restraint in her gaze, as though his very presence made her weary. At first, I brushed off these thoughts. Perhaps I was imagining things. I told myself, families go through phases, and maybe Sam and Jenna were simply in one of those tricky patches. Yet, the more I tried to dismiss it, the clearer it became, like a thorn in my side that I couldn't ignore. What puzzled me most was how naturally it all seemed to come for Jenna. As though her affection had a scale, tipping unfailingly in Lily's favor. When Sam brought home a drawing from school, he'd show it to me, his face lighting up with pride. I'd admire it, point out his details, his colors, his creativity. But Jenna's response was a distracted, "That's nice, honey," before turning her attention to Lily, her face lighting up at whatever small thing she'd done that day. I tried to reason it away. Maybe I was overthinking, maybe I was projecting my own insecurities or fears onto the situation. After all, every parent has a unique bond with each child, right? But there was a limit, a boundary that, if crossed, no amount of reasoning could excuse. And I began to realize, painfully, that Jenna had crossed it. The day I finally allowed myself to acknowledge the problem came unexpectedly. It was a Saturday in early fall, one of those crisp, bright days when everything feels sharper and more vivid. I remember it was a day that should have been perfect. We planned to take the kids to the pumpkin patch, a family tradition that Sam, especially, had always loved. The whole car ride there, he was chattering away, his voice full of excitement as he talked about carving jack-o'-lanterns and roasting pumpkin seeds. But as we arrived and the kids spilled out of the car, eager to start the day, I noticed something. Jenna's eyes lit up as she pulled Lily close, laughing at something she said. The two of them wrapped in their little world. Sam lingered on the edge, glancing back at me as if to gauge whether he should join in or hold back. He looked at his mother, and I saw the fleeting, hopeful expression on his face. He held up his hand, waving as if to say, "I'm here too." Jenna's attention, though, stayed fixed on Lily, and in that moment, something fractured in me. I wasn't imagining it, and I wasn't overreacting. There was a separation, a favoritism that was as real as the chill in the autumn air. I tried to fill the gap, taking Sam by the hand and pointing out the biggest pumpkins, encouraging him to pick one he liked. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on opposite sides of an invisible line. The two of us against something that shouldn't have existed in the first place. I observed Jenna for the rest of the day, watching the way she'd guide Lily to the biggest, most colorful pumpkins, laughing with her and holding her hand. With Sam, she was distant, distracted, almost as if he were an afterthought. It was a small detail, perhaps insignificant to anyone watching, but to me, it felt monumental. This was our family, our children, our shared life, and here I was, feeling helpless, unable to bridge the gap between my son and the woman who should have been his greatest source of comfort and love. As the day wore on, the realization sank deeper, settling uncomfortably in my chest. I tried to brush it off, to focus on the joy of watching the kids run around, but it was like trying to ignore an open wound. Every time I saw Jenna pull Lily close, heard her laugh at her jokes while responding to Sam with a distant hem, the wound ached. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat alone in the living room, my thoughts churning. I told myself that maybe it was just a phase. Maybe Jenna had something on her mind that she wasn't sharing with me. Or maybe, just maybe, I was missing something fundamental about our family dynamic. But deep down, I knew that something had shifted, and I didn't know how to fix it. In the weeks that followed, my awareness grew sharper, as if seeing my family through a new lens. It was as though once the cracks had shown themselves, I couldn't help but notice each one, every small action that confirmed what I feared. It was in the morning, as we'd gather for breakfast, Jenna would ask Lily about her day's plans. what she was excited about, and what she wanted to do. Sam, meanwhile, would get a hurried, "Eat up. Don't be late," before she turned back to her daughter. It happened again when Sam brought home a math test with a solid B+. His face alight with pride as he showed us. I celebrated his hard work, clapping him on the back and telling him how proud I was. Jenna's response was different, a short, "Well, next time, let's aim for an A-OK." Her tone was dismissive, almost as if his effort had fallen short. The look on Sam's face after that moment stayed with me for days. I couldn't shake it the way his expression faltered, the light dimming from his eyes as he tucked the paper away. His shoulders slumping as if he'd failed in some crucial way. He stopped showing her his tests after that, turning to me instead, seeking that affirmation he once might have gotten from both of us. The weight of it gnawed at me. Here was my son, trying his hardest, looking for encouragement, and receiving only a thin veil of approval. It seemed as though Jenna had placed him in a box, a narrow, unforgiving space where he was always slightly less than she expected him to be. I tried to bring it up gently, broaching the topic one evening after the kids had gone to bed. As I tentatively shared my observations, Jenna's reaction was swift and defensive. "Oh, you're overthinking it," she said with a wave of her hand. "I love both of our kids. It's not about favoring anyone. Sam just needs a little more encouragement. That's all." Her words stung in a way I couldn't fully understand. A little more encouragement, as if what he needed was to be pushed harder, to meet an invisible standard she'd set. I wanted to argue, to tell her that Sam didn't need more encouragement, he needed acceptance. Love without condition or limit. But the words caught in my throat, silenced by the fear of making things worse. So I did what I thought was best. I kept my concerns to myself, observing, hoping that with time, things would right themselves. But with each passing day, the divide only grew more evident. The difference in Jenna's tone, her warmth, and her smiles becoming painfully clear. It became an unspoken reality, a silent undercurrent in our household. Lily, buoyed by her mother's love and attention, flourished, growing more confident, more self-assured. Sam, in contrast, seemed to retreat further into himself. His laughter less frequent, his eyes more guarded, and I caught between loyalty to my wife and devotion to my son. Felt trapped, unable to untangle the complex web of emotions and responsibilities that bound us together. I began spending more time with Sam, offering him the support that seemed to elude him in his mother's presence. We'd go for walks, talking about his interests, his struggles at school, his dreams for the future. I wanted him to feel seen, valued, and loved, but as I tried to fill the gaps, Jenna's reactions only grew colder, her glances sharper, as though she sensed that I was building a bridge where she had burned one. In those quiet moments with my son, I felt a painful clarity, a realization that I was, in a way, fighting against my own wife, trying to preserve something that should never have been at risk in the first place. And that knowledge sat heavy on my shoulders, a constant reminder of the silent battle I was waging within our home. Over the following months, the changes in Sam grew more pronounced, more painful to witness. I watched him shrink in spirit, his confidence dissolving like sand slipping through my fingers. He spoke less, kept to himself more, and I could see him learning, day by day, to hide parts of himself, parts that perhaps he believed weren't worthy of love. It tore at me to watch him struggle with the one place he should have felt safest. The moments he used to share freely, like stories from school or new things he'd learned, became fewer. When he'd do something he was proud of, like winning a small contest at school or completing a challenging project, I'd see him hesitate, a flicker of doubt crossing his face before he'd even consider showing his mother. I was becoming his sole source of validation, and it was a burden that both honored and broke me. With Lily, things were different. She had a bright energy that seemed to amplify in her mother's presence, a sparkle in her eye that came from knowing she was adored. She took up more space in our home, her laughter filling rooms and her voice filling silences. And Jenna nurtured that confidence, supporting her interests, celebrating her accomplishments with a warmth that seemed bottomless. In her eyes, Lily could do no wrong, could make no mistake that wasn't forgivable, lovable, even. At times, I wondered if Lily could see the disparity too, if she sensed the way her mother's affection was unevenly distributed. I wanted to believe that, in her innocent heart, she couldn't yet understand the effects of this imbalance. But as the weeks went by, subtle shifts in her behavior emerged. There was a certain possessiveness, a new entitlement, almost as though she understood her role as the favored one and embraced it. One evening, as Sam was quietly working on a puzzle at the dining room table, Lily burst in, clutching a new drawing she'd made, a bright, colorful scene of flowers and animals. She showed it to Jenna, who immediately showered her with praise, admiring every detail as though it were a masterpiece. She kissed her forehead, brushed back her hair, and told her how talented she was. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Sam glance up, the faintest hint of a smile on his face as he looked at his sister's drawing. He tried to join in the moment, leaning forward with genuine admiration in his eyes. perhaps hoping to share the moment of pride with her. But Lily, basking in her mother's approval, turned to Sam with a look I hadn't seen before, a look almost dismissive. Possessive, as if to say, "This moment is mine." She pulled the drawing close to her chest and said, "Mommy likes my drawings best." Jenna laughed, either missing or ignoring the sting her words might hold for Sam. But I saw it, how his face fell, how he went back to his puzzle, his fingers moving slowly over the pieces with a subdued energy. I felt a pang of helplessness and frustration, knowing that I couldn't protect him from this silent pain, this knowledge that in some unspoken way, he was on the outside. In the days that followed, I became even more vigilant, observing how both of my children were evolving under the weight of Jenna's favoritism. Sam grew more reserved, his laughter rare and his joy restrained, and when he did find small moments of happiness, they seemed to be hidden, as though he feared they'd be taken from him. It pained me to see him doubting himself, losing the carefree spirit that had once defined his boyhood. Meanwhile, Lily seemed to thrive, her confidence blossoming but taking on a sharper edge. She began to interrupt Sam, to assert herself in ways that seemed almost dismissive of his feelings. She'd claim the last piece of dessert or take over the television with an ease that suggested she knew she could. That she felt entitled to the best. I started to fear for both of them, each for different reasons. Each affected by this unbalanced love in ways that could shape them for life. Sam, who might grow up believing that his worth was somehow lesser, and Lily, who could come to believe that love was hers for the taking. That she didn't need to earn it, that it was her birthright to be adored without question. I thought of my own childhood, of the small, subtle ways my parents had shaped me with their words, their actions, and their silences. It's a strange thing, the weight of a parent's love, how it can lift you, shape you, or, if withheld, quietly wear you down. I feared what my children would carry with them into adulthood, what hidden wounds they'd bear from this unequal affection, from this unbalanced love. In my quiet desperation, I resolved to be there for Sam, to be the parent he needed, the one who saw him for all he was. I'd take him out to his favorite places, just the two of us, where he could be himself, free from the shadows that sometimes loomed over him at home. I spent hours with him in the backyard, helping him build forts, exploring the woods behind our house, or simply sitting beside him while he shared his thoughts. At first, it was like breaking through ice, chipping away at the guardedness he'd begun to wear, a quiet reserve that should have no place on a boy's face. But slowly, in those moments we spent together, I saw glimmers of the old Sam, the joyful, carefree boy I remembered. He'd tell me about the things he liked, the books he was reading, and the dreams he held close to his heart. Yet even as I grew closer to Sam, my efforts seemed to widen the distance between Jenna and me. I'd feel her watchful eyes on us when we'd come back from an outing, her gaze cold and distant, as if she could sense that I was trying to compensate for her shortcomings. She never voiced it, never accused me outright, but there was an unspoken tension, a discomfort that hung between us. More than once, I found myself questioning my approach, wondering if I was only making things worse. Was I giving Sam false hope? Was I creating an even deeper rift within our family? And yet, I couldn't bring myself to stop. The thought of abandoning him, of leaving him to bear the weight of his mother's disapproval alone, was unbearable. But no matter how much I tried to shield him, there was only so much I could do. Sam was growing older, more perceptive, more aware of the nuances and subtleties of the world around him. I saw it in the way he'd look at his mother, a mixture of longing and resignation in his eyes. He still loved her, still craved her approval, her affection, and as much as I could give him my own love, I knew it wasn't the same. One evening, as we sat in his room, he turned to me, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Dad, do you think Mom loves me?" The question hit me like a blow, a cold shock that left me speechless. I wanted to tell him, of course, that his mother loved him dearly, that he was her pride and joy, but the words caught in my throat, tangled with the truth I'd been hiding, the truth he'd likely already begun to see. I could only put my arm around him, holding him close, hoping that my silence wouldn't hurt him more. The weight of it settled over us both, a silent understanding, a bond born of shared pain, of a love that was strong but tinged with sadness. And in that quiet moment, I knew that I couldn't ignore it any longer. I couldn't keep waiting, hoping that things would change. I had to do something, to protect him, even if it meant confronting Jenna, even if it meant risking the fragile stability of our family. There comes a point in every struggle when things reach an unbearable tension. And I suppose that moment came for me one bitter winter's evening, during a family celebration that should have been a warm and joyful affair. It was Sam's birthday, and although he was turning 12, he still had the wonder of a little boy, his excitement contagious as we decorated the house, set the table, and wrapped his gifts. I'd made sure to pick out things I knew he'd love: a set of paints and brushes, a model airplane kit, and a book he'd been talking about for weeks. I remember watching him as he helped arrange the table, carefully placing each plate, his face glowing with excitement. There was a quiet happiness in him, a glimmer of that innocence I'd feared he'd lost. And for a moment, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps this night would be different. That Jenna would see him as I did, as a boy worthy of love, joy, and celebration. But as the evening unfolded, that fragile hope was crushed. Jenna's actions were subtle but piercing, small gestures that felt like stabs in a wound already raw. She fussed over Lily, asking her opinion on every detail, even asking her to cut the first slice of cake. While Sam sat by, his hands in his lap, his gaze downcast, he looked at her, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement. A word, a smile, anything to confirm that this was his day. It all reached a painful crescendo when Sam unwrapped his gifts. He beamed as he opened the paints, his face lighting up with genuine happiness. But when he looked to his mother for approval, all he received was a brief nod before her attention drifted back to Lily. The room felt tense, every joyful moment undercut by that same, lingering shadow. But it was the last gift that broke me, the final reminder that Sam's happiness seemed to matter so little to her. He opened the book I'd gotten him, a story he'd fallen in love with at school, and when he held it up with pride, Jenna barely glanced at it. Instead, she leaned toward Lily, pulling her close and whispering something that made her giggle, as if Sam's joy was a trivial thing, easily overshadowed. I felt my heart shatter for him. There he was, clutching that book with such pride, his eyes begging for acknowledgement, for a moment of shared happiness. And all he received was silence. His face fell, his shoulders drooping as he tucked the book back in the pile of gifts. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the disappointment he tried to mask. But I knew that this was one too many times. One too many moments of being overlooked, disregarded by the person who should have loved him unconditionally. That night, as I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me with a quiet, defeated expression, and my heart ached with a pain so deep I could hardly bear it. I wanted to tell him that he was loved, that he mattered, that his happiness was worth everything in the world to me. But words felt empty in the face of what he'd experienced, of the silent hurt he carried like a weight on his small shoulders. After he drifted off to sleep, I walked back to the kitchen, where Jenna was cleaning up. The silence between us was heavy, thick with unspoken things. She must have sensed my anger because she looked up, a frown creasing her face, her body tense as though bracing for a confrontation. And for the first time, I couldn't hold it in any longer. You know, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. Today was Sam's birthday. Did you even see him? Did you notice how much he was looking at you, hoping for something, anything from you? She stiffened, her face hardening. Of course I noticed him. But I can't cater to every little need. He has to learn that not everything revolves around him. I felt a cold anger rise in me, sharper than any I'd ever felt. Cater to his needs. He's a child, Jenna, our son. He needed you today, needed to feel like he mattered, that he was worth celebrating. But you couldn't even give him that. She crossed her arms, her expression indifferent. You're overreacting. I treat both of our children with love. You're the one who's always making Sam feel like he's the center of everything. Her words stunned me. In that moment, I saw the depth of the problem, how deeply she was entangled in this favoritism. So much so that she couldn't even recognize it. To her, this was normal, a dynamic she saw as justified, even deserved. She believed that Sam didn't warrant the same level of affection, that he didn't need it as much as Lily did. The realization was devastating. I'd been holding on to hope, telling myself that this was something we could work through, that perhaps with time, she'd come to see her actions, to change. But her words made it clear, she saw no issue, felt no need to change. And in that moment, I knew that I could no longer stand by, watching as my son's spirit was chipped away, little by little. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about Sam, about the quiet, tender soul he was, and how he'd been forced to grow up too soon, learning to live with a mother who could barely see him. I thought of the moments he'd lost, the moments he'd spent searching for approval that never came, and I knew that I couldn't let this continue, that I couldn't allow him to carry the burden of his mother's neglect any longer. I didn't know what the future would hold, didn't have a plan mapped out, but I knew, with a certainty I couldn't ignore, that I had to protect my son. I had to be the father he deserved, even if that meant facing an uncertain path, even if it meant that our family, as it was, might not survive. As I lay there, the weight of that decision pressed down on me, a mixture of fear and relief. Fear of what might come, of the unknown consequences, but relief that, at last, I'd taken a stand, for Sam, for the boy who, above all, deserved a love that didn't falter, didn't waver. In the quiet of that night, I promised myself that I'd be there for him, that I'd make sure he knew he was enough, that he was worthy, that he was loved. And though I couldn't yet see the path forward, I knew that this was the beginning of a journey I had to take for both of us. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog. I went through the motions of everyday life, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of Sam's birthday over and over, the painful truths I'd faced, and Jenna's cold, dismissive response. My heart felt heavy, burdened with the knowledge that things might never be what they once were. I was no longer sure what the future held, and the uncertainty gnawed at me, filling me with a quiet but persistent dread. There was a part of me that wanted to confront Jenna again. To make her see the hurt she was causing. To force her to understand the damage her favoritism had wrought. But I knew, deep down, that no amount of words could change her if she wasn't willing to see the truth. She'd made her stance clear, defending her actions as though they were somehow justified, as if loving our son was a burden instead of a joy. Unsure where to turn, I found myself reaching out to the one person who might understand, a close friend from college. Someone who had known me long before I became a husband and father. Mike had always been a good listener, someone who had been by my side through life's twists and turns. A steady anchor when things got rough. He had kids of his own, understood the complexities of family life, and had faced his share of challenges. I hoped, somehow, that he could offer perspective, a voice of reason amid the chaos. We met at a small cafe in town, a quiet place with worn wooden tables and soft lighting, where the hum of conversation provided a comforting background noise. As I sat across from him, I struggled to find the right words, wondering how to explain something so deeply personal, so painful, but as soon as I started talking, the words came, spilling out in a way I hadn't expected. I told him about Jenna's favoritism, about Sam's pain, about the look on my son's face that had haunted me since his birthday. I spoke about my helplessness, my anger, my frustration, and the promise I'd made to myself to protect Sam, no matter the cost. Mike listened patiently, nodding as he took it all in, his expression shifting from sympathy to concern. When I'd finished, he took a deep breath, his gaze thoughtful as he looked at me. "That's a heavy load you're carrying," he said quietly, "and it sounds like you've been carrying it alone for a long time." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. He was right. I'd been keeping this struggle to myself, trying to fix things without acknowledging how deeply it was affecting me. How alone I'd felt in my role as a father, unable to bridge the widening gap between my wife and son. Mike leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Have you thought about what you want to do? I mean, really thought about it, not just what you're willing to tolerate, but what you want for yourself and your kids?" I hadn't let myself consider that question fully. I'd been so focused on holding everything together, on making sure that Sam felt loved and supported, that I hadn't allowed myself to think about what I wanted, or what might happen if things didn't change. I want him to know he's enough," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I want him to know he doesn't have to fight for love in his own home." Mike nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Then that's your answer. You can't control how Jenna feels or acts, but you can control how you show up for Sam. You can give him the stability and love he needs, even if it means changing what family looks like." His words settled deep within me, a mixture of relief and fear. I knew he was right. I couldn't force Jenna to change, couldn't make her love Sam the way he deserved, but I could be there for him, fully and unconditionally, creating a space where he felt safe, valued, and loved. Mike gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You're a good dad, and I know you'll do what's best for your son. Just remember that sometimes, what's best isn't always easy, but it's worth it." As I drove home that night, his words echoed in my mind. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a clarity that had eluded me for so long. For the first time in months, I felt a faint glimmer of hope, a belief that, somehow, I could find a way through this, that I could be the father Sam needed, even if it meant facing hard truths and making difficult decisions. The days that followed were filled with reflection, a quiet resolve settling within me. I found myself spending more intentional time with Sam, creating moments that reminded him of his worth, showing him through my actions that he was deeply loved. I'd help him with his homework, talk to him about his dreams, listen to his stories, and assure him that he was more than enough, just as he was. With each passing day, I could see a change in him, a small but steady growth in his confidence, a spark of hope returning to his eyes. He began to open up more, sharing his thoughts and fears, allowing himself to be vulnerable in a way that took courage, especially after all he'd been through. And every time he looked at me with that quiet, trusting gaze, I felt a renewed determination to protect him, to create a life where he didn't have to question his worth. But amid this new sense of purpose, I knew I couldn't avoid the reality of our family dynamic forever. Jenna's favoritism continued, her attention and affection flowing naturally to Lily, while Sam often stood on the sidelines, forced to watch from a distance. And I could see how it affected Lily, too, how she grew accustomed to being the center of her mother's world. Her sense of entitlement growing in ways that worried me. It was a delicate balance, trying to navigate my role as a father to both of them, to ensure that each child felt loved and valued. Despite the uneven distribution of their mother's affection, I wanted Lily to know she was loved, but I didn't want her to grow up believing that love was something to be taken for granted, a gift reserved for a chosen few. And I wanted Sam to feel valued, to understand that his worth wasn't tied to his mother's approval, that he didn't need to compete for love that should have been his unconditionally. As I continued down this path, I felt a growing sense of urgency, a need to make a definitive choice for our family's future. I couldn't bear the thought of Sam carrying this burden into adulthood, of Lily growing up with a skewed understanding of love and fairness. I wanted them both to experience a childhood filled with acceptance, a foundation they could carry with them into the future. It was then that I made the decision to seek professional help. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I couldn't do this alone, that I needed guidance and support if I was going to create a better life for my children. I reached out to a family counselor, hoping that, somehow, they could help us navigate this difficult journey, to find a way to heal the wounds that had formed between us, and to restore a sense of balance, of love, that I'd feared was lost. The next step, I knew, would be to talk to Jenna, to open up a conversation that I'd been avoiding, to face the hard truths that had been building between us. It wouldn't be easy, I didn't expect it to be, but I was ready to fight for my son, to protect him, and to create a life where he could feel safe, seen, and loved. And as I prepared for that conversation, I felt a quiet strength rise within me, a strength born of love, of loyalty, and of the unbreakable bond between a father and his son. The day I decided to confront Jenna was grey and quiet, the kind of winter afternoon where the world feels subdued, as though waiting for something. I'd been carrying this conversation within me for weeks, turning it over in my mind, trying to find the right words, the right approach. I'd practiced what I wanted to say, knowing that every word, every gesture, would matter. I needed her to understand the depth of the issue, to see, really see, what had been happening in our home. I owed it to Sam to try, even if it meant facing her denial and resistance. After dinner, once the kids were in bed, I found her sitting in the living room, a book resting on her lap. She looked up as I walked in, and I felt a pang of apprehension as I noticed the familiar warmth in her eyes when she looked at me. This was a woman I'd loved for years, the mother of my children, someone who had once been my closest confidant, my partner in everything. Yet, here I was, about to unravel everything we'd built together, driven by a truth I could no longer ignore. I sat down across from her, taking a deep breath to steady myself. Jenna, there's something we need to talk about, I began, my voice calm but firm. She looked at me, an uncertain expression crossing her face as she waited for me to continue. Have you noticed how different things are between you and Sam? I asked, choosing my words carefully. The way you treat him compared to Lily, the way he looks to you, searching for something he doesn't seem to get. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a defensive edge creeping into her gaze. I don't know what you mean, she replied, her tone dismissive. I love both of our kids. I don't know why you keep making it sound like I don't care about Sam. The familiar denial stung, but I held my ground. I'm not saying you don't care. I'm saying there's a difference. A clear difference, in the way you show it. And it's hurting him, Jenna. It's hurting Sam. And it's affecting our family. She looked away, her jaw tight, her hands gripping the edge of the book. This is ridiculous. You're blowing things out of proportion. I'm a good mother, and I love both of our children. Just because I'm closer to Lily doesn't mean I don't care about Sam. I took a deep breath, fighting the frustration that simmered beneath the surface. It's not about being closer to one or the other, I said slowly. It's about the way you show up for them, the way you respond to them. Sam shouldn't have to fight for your attention. He shouldn't have to feel like he's on the outside, waiting for scraps of love that should come naturally. Jenna shook her head, her expression hardening. I'm tired of this, tired of you making me the villain. I do the best I can. Maybe if you weren't so focused on finding fault with me, you'd see that Sam is just a sensitive kid, that he needs to toughen up. Her words cut deeply, exposing the core of the issue, her unwillingness to see Sam for who he was. Her belief that his sensitivity was somehow a flaw, a weakness. I felt an ache in my chest, a pain I couldn't suppress. Jenna, he's not a problem to be fixed. He's our son, and he needs your acceptance, not your criticism. For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and tense. I watched her, searching for some sign of understanding, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she'd begin to see the truth. But her expression remained cold, her gaze unyielding. What exactly do you want me to do? She asked, her tone laced with impatience. Do you want me to pretend that Sam and Lily are the same? Because they're not, they're different, and I can't change how I feel. Her words felt like a final blow, a confirmation of everything I'd feared. She was unwilling to change, unable to see the damage her favoritism was causing. And in that moment, I knew that no amount of talking, no careful choice of words, would make a difference. I don't expect you to change your feelings, I said quietly, a resignation settling over me. But I do expect you to recognize that your actions are affecting Sam. Affecting his sense of self, his happiness. He needs us, both of us, to make him feel valued. And if you're not willing to do that, then I have to do what's best for him. Her face twisted with anger, her eyes flashing. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm taking him to counseling, I replied, my voice calm but resolute. I'm going to find someone who can help him, who can help us understand what he's going through and how to support him. I want us all to go, as a family, so we can work through this together. Jenna scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. You're being ridiculous. He doesn't need counseling, he just needs to grow up, to learn that not everything will be handed to him. Her words, so dismissive and cold, settled over me like a final weight. I realized, in that moment, that I could no longer rely on Jenna to change, to recognize the pain she was causing. I could no longer count on her to be the mother Sam needed. And as much as that hurt, I knew that my responsibility was to protect my son, to create a safe, loving environment for him, even if it meant facing this journey alone. Then I'll go with him, I said firmly, a sense of clarity washing over me. I'll be there for him, to help him through this. And if you can't be a part of that, if you're unwilling to try, then that's your choice. But I won't let him suffer in silence any longer. She looked away, her jaw clenched, refusing to meet my gaze. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the words that had gone unspoken, all the hopes and expectations that had died along the way. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I felt an emptiness I couldn't ignore. I knew that this was the beginning of a new path, one that might lead us further apart, but one I had to take for Sam's sake. There was no turning back now. I had made my choice, and though I didn't know what the future held, I felt a quiet strength within me, a determination to give my son the love, stability, and acceptance he needed, no matter the cost. The following week, I scheduled an appointment with a family counselor, a kind woman with a calm, understanding demeanor. I took Sam with me, and though he was hesitant at first, I explained that this was a safe place where he could talk about anything that was on his mind, that he didn't have to hide or hold back. In that small, quiet room, with the soft hum of the counselor's voice guiding us, Sam began to open up. Slowly, hesitantly, he spoke of the things he'd been carrying, the loneliness, the feeling of being less than, the longing for his mother's love. I sat beside him, holding his hand, my heart aching as I listened to his pain, his vulnerability, the innocence he'd had to give up too soon. Through those sessions, I began to see a glimmer of hope, a light in Sam's eyes that hadn't been there in so long. I realized that, even if Jenna refused to join us, even if she continued on her own path, I could still create a space for Sam where he felt valued, where he felt seen. The weeks turned into months, and though things with Jenna remained strained, I felt a sense of purpose guiding me forward. I spent as much time as I could with Sam, building him up, reminding him that he was loved unconditionally, and little by little, he grew stronger, his laughter returning, his spirit healing. Months passed, and with each counseling session, with every quiet moment spent in shared understanding, I watched Sam bloom into himself again. It was like watching spring emerge after a long winter, gradual, cautious, but beautiful in its persistence. There were days when he'd laugh freely, telling me about a new book he'd read or a project he'd worked on at school, his eyes bright and unguarded, and in those moments, I felt a wave of relief, a deep and abiding gratitude that I'd made the choice to be there for him, to fight for him, to protect the gentle soul that had, for so long, been overshadowed. Our relationship grew in a way I hadn't anticipated. He began to trust me more openly, confiding in me with a quiet honesty that was humbling. He spoke of his fears and his dreams, of his hopes for the future. And each word was a reminder that I'd made the right choice, that I'd found a way to give him the love and stability he deserved. Meanwhile, things with Jenna remained strained. She had refused to join our counseling sessions, insisting that I was the one creating problems where none existed. And as difficult as it was to accept, I'd come to terms with the fact that I couldn't change her, couldn't force her to see the pain she'd caused. It was a hard reality to face, knowing that my marriage had become a shell of what it once was. A silent partnership held together only by routine and shared history. But through it all, I found strength in my bond with Sam, a connection that had grown deeper, more resilient with each passing day. I began to see the world through his eyes, understanding the challenges he faced, the quiet strength that had sustained him through so much pain. I saw his kindness, his empathy, his ability to see beauty in the simplest things, and I knew that he would grow into a remarkable young man, one who would carry with him a resilience forged through struggle. One evening, as we sat on the porch together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Sam turned to me, his gaze steady, his voice soft but sure. "Dad," he said, "thank you for being there, for seeing me." His words touched something deep within me, a well of emotion that I hadn't realized was there. I looked at him, my heart full, my voice thick with gratitude. "I'll always be here for you, Sam, no matter what." In that quiet moment, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a feeling that, despite the difficulties we'd faced, despite the fractured nature of our family, we'd found something unbreakable, something that could withstand whatever lay ahead. Our journey hadn't been easy, and there were still days when I felt the weight of it all. The lingering sadness over what our family might have been, what it could have become if things had been different. But I'd come to realize that love is not always about perfection. about fulfilling an ideal. Sometimes, love is about resilience, about showing up in the hardest of moments, about choosing to see and value the people who need us most. As time passed, I noticed a change in Sam that went beyond the surface. He'd grown more confident, more self-assured, and I could see in his eyes a sense of worth that hadn't been there before. He no longer waited for Jenna's approval, no longer looked to her for validation. He knew, at last, that he was enough, that he didn't have to fight for love that should have always been his. My relationship with Lily had also grown stronger, more balanced. I was careful to show her the same unconditional love, ensuring she understood that her worth didn't lie in favoritism. That love wasn't something to be competed for. I wanted her to grow up knowing that family meant balance, acceptance, and compassion. And with each passing day, our family found a new rhythm, an unspoken understanding that, though imperfect, carried with it a sense of peace, a stability that had once felt impossible. One day, while Sam and I were walking through the park, he paused, looking up at me with a quiet thoughtfulness that reminded me of how much he'd grown, how much he'd endured and emerged from, stronger than ever. "Dad," he said, his voice steady and sure, "I think things are going to be okay. Even if they're not perfect, I think we're going to be okay." His words brought a smile to my face, a warm surge of pride and love that filled me to my core. "Yes, Sam," I replied, my voice filled with conviction. "We're going to be okay. And whatever happens, I'll always be here for you. That's a promise." As we walked on, side by side, I felt a sense of hope, a belief that our journey had brought us to a place of understanding, of strength. I knew there would be challenges ahead, moments of uncertainty, and days when the weight of the past might still linger, but I also knew that we'd found a way to endure, to heal, to love one another in a way that was both imperfect and beautiful. In the end, I had discovered something invaluable, a truth that had guided me through the darkest moments of this journey. Love, true love, is not about perfection or ease. It is about resilience, about the quiet, unwavering commitment to show up, to be there, even when things fall apart, even when the road is difficult. And as I looked at my son, at the boy who had taught me more about love and strength than I'd ever imagined, I knew that we had built something unbreakable, a bond that would carry us through whatever lay ahead. We walked home together, the sun setting in a blaze of color behind us, a silent promise of the journey we'd walked together and the future that stretched before us, one filled with hope, resilience, and the quiet, enduring love between a father and his son.